Hello, welcome. I'm Barbara Foreman, Director of the REL Southeast. This webinar series is hosted by the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast at Florida State University through funding from the Institute of Education Sciences at the United States Department of Education. Today, we will be talking about several different topics. First of all, we'll be talking about the importance of reliable outcomes. Second, we'll be talking about our REL Southeast project in the state of Mississippi with their literacy initiative as an example of observation tools and developing new measures. Finally, we'll talk about school-wide support for implementation, and then we will answer your questions. When implementing professional development, you typically describe the professional development in depth, the whys, the hows, and the how much. That can be descriptive. In order to achieve What-Worth Clearinghouse standards for outcomes, you will need to choose measures that demonstrate reliability. There are 4 typical types of outcomes that are measured following professional development and coaching. The first involves the knowledge, skills, and/or attitudes of the participants, which are typically teachers. This includes published and standardized tests like certification exams or attitude scales, research-validated quizzes, quizzes that are created specifically for the professional development being evaluated, or a demonstration of performance by the teacher. The next slightly more distal outcome involves demonstration of implementation in the targeted setting, which is typically the classroom. This may involve a classroom observation by a coach, a lead teacher, or a peer teacher, and utilizes a time sampling observation system or one created by the research team to directly measure the target of the instruction. It is important to emphasize to teachers that the observation is for collaborative and not evaluative purposes. Educator implementation can be demonstrated through other kinds of records. For example, implementation checklists can demonstrate teachers' teaching of components of a curriculum, and formative assessments can demonstrate that the student participated in the lesson and learned the content. As an example of behavioral records, suppose that a token economy is put into place whereby students receive tickets for pre-specified behaviors. Implementation can be quantified by the number of tickets exchanged. In positive behavior support, or PBS, reliable measures of implementation exist. For example, the School Evaluation Tool, or SET, defines full implementation of school-wide PBS with a score of at least 80% on the tool. The next, more distal outcomes of professional development involve student achievement on the targeted skill, which most frequently are researcher-designed unit tests of the curriculum. Sometimes curriculum-based measurement can be used as a proximal or distal measure. For measures of behavior, there are several existing reliable measures, including the Behavioral Observation of Students in Schools, or the DBR. For larger systems-level research, people have used number of office discipline referrals, ODR, or number of suspensions. The more distal outcome, but often the ultimate target of PD efforts, is generalized student achievement. There are several types of achievement outcomes. First, they can be scores from high-stakes state test or norm-referenced gold standard test of the theoretical construct that is being addressed. Second, achievement outcomes can be indicators of school engagement, such as attendance or dropout rates. Third, achievement outcomes can be attainment of life achievement goals, such as graduation or industry certifications. Student grades are typically avoided as outcome measures due to lack of reliability and replicability. Some of you already know what reliability and validity are, but it's worth revisiting these very important constructs. And we have an example here of a bullseye target in a 2x2 matrix where our ideal is the bottom right hand, valid and reliable. But first, let's review what is reliability. It refers to replicability. For example, cars are reliable if they start every time we need them. When we weigh ourselves on a scale, we expect to obtain the same weight a short time later. A test is reliable if it measures student achievement consistently, whether the student takes the test in the morning or afternoon of the same day or a day or two later, and that's test-retest reliability. Another measure of reliability is internal consistency. According to students' performance on comparable items on a test, the score should be similar. Finally, alternate form reliability ensures that two forms of the same test are very highly correlated. Values for reliability coefficients range from 0 to 1.0. A reliability of 0 means no reliability, and 1.0 means perfect reliability. Due to measurement error, perfect reliability never happens. Generally, if the reliability of a standardized test is greater than 0.8, then the test is said to have very good reliability. If it is below 0.5, it would not be considered a reliable test. Validity refers to the accuracy of an assessment, whether it's aligned to the theoretical construct, called construct validity, aligned to the content, called content validity, and scores on other measures, called concurrent validity, or future measures, called predictive validity. Information on reliability and validity can be found in the technical manuals of the tests you're using. A test can be reliable, meaning you get the same score if you retake it, but not valid, meaning that the test doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure. And you can see that in the top right quadrant. You have reliable scores in the yellow circle there, but they're not on the bullseye, so they're not valid. And then vice versa, you can have a test that's valid, so you have that green bullseye, but not reliable, meaning the scores around it are not replicable. Thus, you have to have both validity and reliability for your outcome measures. I will now turn this over to Dr. Jessica Olson, who will talk about the Mississippi Initiative.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Today I'm going to share a bit about a project that we've been working on in Mississippi, where we've had to develop some of our own measures because the measures did not exist to ascertain what we needed to for this study. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of how this study started, and then talk about the measures. Like many other states and local education agencies, the state of Mississippi in 2012 decided to put policies and resources into place to improve literacy instruction in the state. In order to impact student literacy outcomes, the state of Mississippi knew that they needed an intensive support plan for teachers in their early grades, kindergarten through third grade, where research shows the largest impact can be made. The goal was to improve instruction and improve student performance, and to ensure that while local control remained, and I quote from the director of this project, all teachers speak the same language about effective reading instruction. Through the REL Southeast, we have provided support to the Mississippi Department of Education, particularly around measuring the implementation of the concepts teachers learned in training. This involves measuring the PD participants' knowledge and creating an observation tool that measures implementation in the classroom. The major components of this, first of all, this project had a comprehensive state-level support. The major components of this initiative were to provide training to 10,400 K-3 teachers and elementary school principals, and to hire, train, and support 78 state coaches to work in 125 targeted schools with the lowest reading scores. The experts coaches were embedded in the target schools. The Mississippi Department of Education identified 125 schools based on 2 years of data on the state ELA exam. The target schools were the schools with the highest percentage of students below proficient in third grade reading. The 78 coaches were placed in these 125 schools and served them 2 to 3 days per week for the entire academic year. The coaching model provided on-site, job-embedded coaching with classroom observations to provide feedback, modeled best practice and facilitated professional learning communities that focused on data, collaboration, and improving instructional practices. Additionally, the state provided research-based early literacy professional development. The Mississippi Department of Education went through a procurement process to identify a research-based professional development curriculum to ensure that all teachers speak the same language about effective reading instruction, and to build the concept and pedagogical knowledge of K-3 reading teachers. Ultimately, the department went with the LETTERS program, the Language Essentials for Teaching Reading and Spelling through Cambium-Sopris West. This was a state implementation of the PD, and the goal was to train all 10,400 educators, including higher education faculty, in 3 years. There was an intensive training schedule that balanced the needs of the schools. The goal of this initiative was not just to boost the lowest performing schools, but to improve all schools. So, in order to meet the goal, the MDE developed an intensive training schedule. They chose, rather than to do a trainer than trainer, to ensure that everybody is on the same page. The training was completely provided by nationally trained Cambium-Sopris West LETTERS trainers. The training was directly to the practitioners. The training was provided in a hybrid fashion of online modules and face-to-face workshops. To best meet the needs of the schools and to ensure that the target schools got the most intensive training with the most face-to-face time, there were 2 options. Both options included roughly 40 hours of online content and 2 series of face-to-face workshops. The primary difference was that the target schools received 3 days of face-to-face training at a time for a total of 6 days, while other schools received 2 days of face-to-face training at a time for a total of 4 days. Now, it is important to note that non-target schools could opt to do 3 days if desired. However, because it was not feasible for teachers to be out of school for 6 days in one academic year, typically the teachers did one phase consisting of 20 hours of online work and 2 to 3 days of workshops per year. It's also important to mention that the training was completely free. Additionally, with this initiative, there was a sustainability plan. Because evidence suggests that simply going to a PD workshop is not going to result in sustained changes in performance and practice, the department also created a sustainability plan. One aspect of that plan was embedded coaching in the target schools, and another aspect was a phase 3 of the training. The third phase included additional online modules and training provided on-site through professional learning communities. Additionally, this initiative has extended to early childhood educators with additional LETTERS modules for pre-K providers. Next, I'm going to describe an observation tool that the REL Southeast created to support the efforts of the department. In order for this observation tool to work, there had to be system-wide support from superintendents, principals, and teachers. To support the coaches, one of the things that the REL Southeast provided was an observation tool that the coaches used to capture instruction and use the tool to provide feedback to teachers on their instruction. One of the critical things about this tool is that it had a systems-wide support. That is, superintendents and principals knew about the tool, understood its purpose, and authorized the coaches to use it. This also extended to videotaping classroom instruction when the coach was using the tool to conduct classroom observations. Importantly, the emphasis was that the tool was collaborative, not evaluative observations. The way the MDE got support for conducting observations, particularly during a time when teacher evaluations are a sensitive subject, was to continuously reiterate that the observations, while formal, were not evaluative. The data collected would not be shared with anyone outside of the teacher-coach relationship and with the REL Southeast for research purposes. Therefore, principals, superintendents, nobody with any sort of ability to impede any sort of professional development would have access to the observations. So the components of the observation tool were to observe explicit instruction of each of the critical parts of instruction identified in the training. It quantified student engagement and had indicators of quality of instruction. So the tool is actually being used to gain insight into the teacher's use of explicit instruction and to provide systematic feedback. Additionally, there was a specific plan for reliability and replication. Since this webinar is on developing an evaluation, we need to talk about how this tool was used for a study. The observations, conducted twice per year on randomly selected teachers at each grade, were provided as de-identified data to the REL Southeast for analysis of changes in quality, engagement, and teaching competencies. Results are not yet shareable, and this study, I do need to also emphasize, was not an evaluation of the PD, but looked at changes in practice and instructional practices and teacher knowledge. So again, I reiterate, it is not an evaluation of what was happening. Regarding the validity of this tool, the observation tool was a combination of previously used and validated tools from the literature on classroom observations of reading instruction. What is particularly exciting to us at the REL Southeast, and a tip towards the validity of the tool, is that even in the absence of the study, the coaches are continuing to use the tool to conduct observations and provide feedback. The coaches are now training their own new coaches on the tool, and there's sustained use of the tool. Regarding reliability, the coaches videotaped the classroom instruction when they conducted the observation. All of the coaches came together at the end of each semester and traded videos to score the instruction of the teacher that they were not familiar with. This was done to establish inter-rater reliability, to ensure that the coach that was familiar with the teacher was scoring the coach or the teacher the same way that another coach would score them if they were unfamiliar with the individual. Moreover, before coaches ever went into the schools to use the observation tool, they were trained and had to meet a certain reliability on a training video. The next aspect of this particular project was to look at changes in teacher knowledge. Again, not to evaluate if the professional development worked, but simply to see if there were changes in teacher knowledge over time. So now that you know broadly about the initiative and the observation tool, I'm going to talk about a larger measure that was used in the study. The observation tool was only used by coaches and only in the target schools. However, as you know, the initiative was for all K-3 teachers. The department wanted to measure changes in teacher knowledge as teachers were exposed to the professional development. So in order to have an unbiased assessment of changes, we created a new teacher knowledge measure of early literacy skills. It was important to not just utilize quizzes embedded in the letters module, because then you run into the issue of over-alignment, which according to the What Works Clearinghouse makes the outcome no longer eligible. Over-align simply means that when the outcome is aligned or tailored specifically to the intervention, in this case the letters professional development, the study findings may not be an accurate assessment if it is too related to the materials itself rather than the overall content and concepts provided in the intervention. So I'm going to talk next about the development of the Mississippi Assessment of Teacher Knowledge, which we refer to as the MAT-K. Developing the MAT-K was a three-phase cyclic process. First, we had to identify items, then administer the items, and check the tests and the items for overall reliability. For this webinar, I'm only going to address how we identified items and the checking the test and the item properties. How a measure is administered varies. We opted to administer the assessment online, but it could easily be administered paper pencil. There are some pros and cons to either route and are not within the scope of today's webinar. With this study, we conducted a literature review of teacher knowledge of early literacy skills. Luckily, there have been several studies that address this topic, or at least subcomponents of this topic. By sourcing items that have been previously used addresses the issue of face validity. These items have been previously used to measure the specific construct of interest, teacher knowledge of early literacy skills. Each item that had been previously used was made available to us was entered into a database. Once we established a database of all previous items, we then coded each item according to the content, such as phonological awareness or comprehension, type, such as a knowledge or application or teaching, and a matching letters module. However, there was not a single study that sufficiently addressed every single outcome or every single component that was taught in letters. That is why we needed to combine items from a variety of sources. Additionally, not all items were in the same format. For example, some were multiple choice while others were fill in the blank. Some had 2 choices or some had 8 choices to answer. So we had to modify items so that they were all similar. We chose to go with multiple choices with 4 options. See, for example, the question on your right. The content covered was comprehension, and it was a knowledge question. We also had pre-established a target number of items for our measure based on the amount of time that teachers would have to respond to the assessment. Based on the coding, we created a matrix so that we would have an even number of items by content area, type, and matching letters module. For example, we wanted to make sure we had 10 items for each content area and make sure those 10 items were evenly spread by type. Moreover, we wanted to make sure that each letters module was represented evenly. Once the matrix, the target number of items, was established and we had a full bank of items that were coded and sufficiently modified, a team of content area experts identified the items with the best face validity to fill the matrix. Because the intent of our study was to model change in teacher knowledge, we had to have multiple iterations of the assessment. Thus, it was important to have multiple versions. With any evaluation, it is ideal to have at least a pre-test and a post-test. This is particularly important if a quasi-experimental study is conducted, so that baseline equivalence can be established or statistically accounted for if it is within an acceptable range for adjustment. For more information on that, you can look at the What Works Clearinghouse. To create multiple forms, we randomly assigned the final bank of items to one of 3 test banks: pre-test, post-test, and linking. The linking items went in both the pre-test and post-test and served as a way to equate the 2 tests. All of these steps ensure the validity of the assessment. Next, I'm going to address reliability. At this point, I'm going to veer away specifically from the Mississippi example because we conducted an item response theory analysis of the items, which is far too complex to address in this webinar. However, today I'm going to talk about the minimal tests for assessing reliability of a measure. Importantly, each of these measures of reliability you can easily conduct in Excel, and you can see 2 links that will provide you to tutorials and templates. The goal of designing a reliable instrument is for scores on similar items to be related, internally consistent, but for each to contribute some unique information as well. If you follow the steps we provided in the Mississippi example, you know that your items are valid and consistent according to content. However, you want to make sure that you have sufficient variety on these items. That is, you want to make sure you have some items that are easier and some that are harder so that there is variation between respondents. You wouldn't want all respondents to have 100% correct or 0% correct, or even all of them having only 50% correct. Chromebox alpha is the most common measure of test reliability based on item variances. Values higher than 0.7 are acceptable, though 0.8 indicates good reliability. Chromebox alpha is a measure of internal consistency, or how closely related the items are as a group. It ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 means the items are not at all related, and 1 means the items are redundant. You would never actually achieve 1, but as you get closer and higher, that's when you would know that they are too redundant. A maximum alpha of 0.90 is recommended. From Chromebox alpha, you can also find the measurement error. So if you square Chromebox alpha and subtract it from 1, you have an estimate of the measurement error in a test. As reliability increases, error decreases, meaning that the fraction of a test score that is likely due to measurement error decreases. Chromebox alpha addresses the overall test reliability. It is also important to look at the individual items. When you do this through point-by-serial correlation, or also known as item-to-total correlation. It's the correlation between right and wrong scores on the item and the total scores across all items. It's also really important to note, and I should have said this before Chromebox alpha, that when you're doing these item statistics and test statistics, it has to be on the scored matrix of items, not the raw responses. That is, if your responses are 1, 2, 3, 4 as your multiple choice, you would want to make sure that what you are scoring, you score those items, and so your matrix is in a 0, 1, 0 incorrect, 1 correct. The goal of when you're looking at the point-by-serial correlation is to have items that are correlated to the total score. This simply helps identify items that might be poorly written, misleading, not have a clear correct response, are not sufficiently related to the entire test, or have other bias. Removing poor items according to point-by-serial correlation will increase the overall reliability of the assessment. Additionally, there's the p-value, which is the proportion of individuals that got the item correct. The higher the p-value, the easier the item. For a more reliable test, however, p-values should be spread out. while still having a sufficient point-by-serial correlation. While these statistics may seem daunting or complex, they are incredibly important to ensure that your measure is valid and reliable. A measure may have great face validity, but if it is not statistically reliable, it is no longer a valid assessment. The great thing about these statistics is that they do not require special software to calculate. On this slide, as I mentioned, you see 2 links to websites that provide templates and walk you through how to calculate Cronbach's alpha, point-by-serial correlation, and the p-value. Both of these websites are very friendly to someone that may not be comfortable around statistics and are particularly geared towards educators. At this time, I'm going to switch over to Kevin Smith, who will talk about school-wide support for implementation.
Thank you, Jessica. My name is Kevin Smith, and I am the Research Alliance Manager with the REL Southeast. I wanted to thank Dr. Foreman for discussing reliability and validity of measures, and thank Dr. Folsom for describing an example of a project that required the development of a new measure. Really appreciated learning more myself about those efforts, and now I'm going to switch gears and discuss implementation, particularly at a school-wide level. So when you're considering implementation around a school-wide support level, one of the big questions to ask is, who should I start with when I'm going in for a recruiting effort? Of course, it's going to be helpful to find someone who can help support and potentially even shepherd the project with you through a partnership from start to completion. In addition, we discussed, actually Dr. Foreman discussed logic models earlier in one of our prior webinars. In addition to using logic models, again, which have been discussed, it may also be helpful to consider project management tools to ensure that clear goals and timelines are established with progress benchmarks for the project clearly outlined along the way. So again, just thinking about this, really clear, detailed consideration for how the project's going to work, who's going to be involved in the project, and making sure that benchmarks are set and that you're meeting those benchmarks along the way. In terms of collaboration, it's incredibly important from working on past large-scale professional development and research initiatives to consider which districts and/or schools are most ready, willing, and able to partner on such a large-scale initiative. If you're working across a district, you may wish to consider who the best contact may be to begin these conversations regarding the project, thinking about the importance of having a clear, understandable, why this, why now message to help explain why the initiative should be of interest to a district and/or school. For example, if you wanted to start a large-scale literacy professional development project, it might be helpful to start with the curriculum contact at the district who oversees literacy initiatives, especially if your professional development will involve literacy strategies. If you speak with that contact and find they're interested, a next step may be to set up a meeting or call with the curriculum contact and the superintendent or executive director who oversees principals of the schools that you plan to work with. It's incredibly important to have both of those folks or both of those groups involved so that you know you'll have school-wide and even district-wide buy-in. If that's a successful conversation after the district has provided information on the effort to the school principals, it may next be beneficial to set up a conference call with the principals to share further details and answer any questions they may have. The next step would be to establish a face-to-face meeting with the principals and other school-based administrators, instructional coaches, and teachers at each school site. At those meetings, it may be helpful to share user-friendly tie-ins to current practices or curricula. Teachers in particular will often want to know clearly how this new initiative fits in with their current practices. Other important components to consider regarding buy-in at the school level may be faculty votes on support for the initiative, which may be something a principal or district requests, clear commitment to attending the professional development by both the principal and staff, and of course schedules that work with busy teacher schedules. Then comfort, of course, amongst the staff with observing others. As Dr. Folsom mentioned earlier, that's a large part of many professional development efforts, and of course being observed as part of the professional development efforts. It also would be really important to have an upfront discussion of any quizzes or assessments that may be part of the initiative to make sure that teachers, educators, principals, all of those involved in this effort will be comfortable knowing that there's a quiz or assessment that's tied into this effort. Okay, looking at our next area to talk about with coaching or peer coaching. So in order to have coaching or peer coaching, of course, it's important for both the outside support of the organization bringing the initiative to the school and the inside support from educators at the school. To have both of those groups on board is incredibly important. So considerations need to be made for who will be available for coaching or peer coaching. An important common issue to overcome is what I like to call the close the door phenomenon following many professional development efforts, where teachers will go through training but may be unwilling or unable to see the importance, value, or even possibility of the content or techniques working with their specific students. So they close the door and continue current practice with a this too shall pass mentality. Through establishing coaching expectations and protocols for relationship building, modeling, and support, this can be overcome. Clear timelines must be developed for coaching, as well as for individuals and teams to debrief, troubleshoot, analyze data, and make decisions about follow-up. Other important points to consider include developing supports to emphasize collaboration among all teachers serving the students, not just the teachers who are going through professional development, but other teachers who serve those students during the course of the day or week and across grades, so that there's vertical articulation among the group who may or even may not be part of the project, but it's good to have a clear understanding across the entire school. Finally, regular observations, as Dr. Folsom mentioned earlier, with checklists that have been shared and explained to the teachers ahead of time are important. Again, as she mentioned, the observations that they're using are non-evaluative, but the idea needs to be very clear to the teachers. They need to have a clear understanding for what the checklist is ahead of time and what it'll be used for. Those using the checklist, as she mentioned, also should be trained for consistency and iterative reliability. I want to make sure that everyone's seeing and rating the content or techniques that are being used in the same way. Okay, some considerations for low implementation. So regarding low implementation, some closely monitored research studies are able to address implementation issues during the course of the study rather than just describing the degree of implementation after the study. Here's one way to address it within the course of the study. Before the study, determine what criteria constitutes the appropriate level of implementation. So what's the minimum that you really need to see in terms of implementation? Then during the study, if a participant does not meet that criteria, have a plan in place to provide specific additional supports to that participant. So how are we going to coach? How are we going to support them if things are not going the way we expected? Here are two examples. So a research team may determine that participants need to score at least 80% on a knowledge test to demonstrate mastery of new content. For those participants that do not achieve 80%, additional practice sessions may be scheduled for those schools, or even a more discreet way to address low implementation may be through observations. When a participant does not reach a pre-specified level on the observation, the coach may provide more frequent supports like modeling, co-teaching, or feedback to reach the goal of higher implementation. So again, setting that up and explaining that process ahead of time with the coaches, with the teachers, so that there's clear understanding is very important. So the criteria could be set on a variety of factors. It's usually determined through previous studies, or it may be a property of the measure that's being used. For example, an implementation of school-wide positive behavior supports, as Dr. Foreman used the example earlier, there's a measure of implementation called the school-wide evaluation tool. This tool has predetermined criteria. Schools must achieve 80% in order to say that they're implementing school-wide positive behavior supports. So that's, again, one example of potential implementation. Okay, we're going to have a question and answer session. We see some questions have come in, and we'll be discussing those. Before we do, we wanted to talk about the next few sessions of this webinar. So webinar 4 will involve going deeper into analyzing results, and that'll be January 19th at 2 p.m. Webinar 5 will be going deeper into interpreting results and presenting findings. That'll be January 21st at 2 p.m. So at this time, we really thank you for all the questions that were submitted during today's webinar. We were able to answer a number of the questions during the webinar, but if you have additional questions at this time, please type them in the chat box now. We're going to go ahead and pause for a second, stay on the webinar for 10 or 15 more minutes to answer any additional questions and to read the questions that have already been submitted. So at this point, we'll pause for just a moment. We'll be back in a few moments and discuss the questions that have come in and provide some responses.
We have some questions that are starting to come in, so we're going to try and address them as best as we can. We are creating a frequently asked questions document that there are some questions that we will address in there because they have been coming up frequently. The first question I'm going to address is how would you handle testing the validity and reliability of instruments with open-ended questions with partial credit answers scores are given? This is pretty complex. For something where there's open-ended questions, you have to develop a coding scheme to develop what you're going to constitute as right and wrong. Something such as what we demonstrated with the Chromebox Alpha and with the item to total correlation, those sort of things you really couldn't do if you're going to be giving partial credit. So that becomes challenging. There are some really advanced techniques such as partial credit modules for doing that sort of thing, and I would highly encourage you to look into just doing some Googling on item response theory, but it requires some pretty advanced statistical training to be able to do that. But it is possible when there are open-ended questions. What it really comes down to is being able to code the answers.
And let me just give an example. We were developing a reading comprehension test for Florida, and so we collected pilot data that was representative of the demographics of Florida and the ages of the students, and we looked at their responses. So you code, but you need to code from the range, a representative range of the cognitive development in your sample. And then you need to get inter-rater reliability on your scoring. That's absolutely crucial. And so you have to get agreement of 0.80 or better on scoring, right or wrong. As soon as you start having 0, 1, 2, 3, or even more like 0 to 5 rating systems, it's very difficult to get good inter-rater reliability. So as much as possible, try to get it to yes or no, or maybe 0, 1, 2.
Thank you. One of the other questions that we have here is about the teacher knowledge assessment. Is it ready to be shared with the professional community? At this time, it is not. However, it is being embedded into a report that we're producing on the Mississippi study, and it will be fully in there, including how to score the assessment and those sort of things. And we believe that there might be a separate document that's coming out that highlights just that measure as opposed to the entire study. So for that sort of information and for any additional information related to the work that's being done with the REL Southeast, I would encourage you to come to our website, rel-se.fcrr.org or .fsu.org. And then also follow the IES news flashes, because that's where you'll get a lot of the information about work that is coming out. In terms of, we had a question asking about smaller scale projects that meet WWC standards, with the example that we're training 15 principals per year and have no control over the principals selected. And just because a study has a small number of participants does not mean that it cannot meet the WWC standards. We would encourage you to go to the WWC and look through their examples they have there. They also have WWC standards for single subject studies as well. I'm going to go ahead and mute it again, and if you have additional questions, please put them in. We'll be here for at least another 10 minutes. We're back again with another question related to the teacher knowledge test. Again, at this time, we are not able to share it, but every item that is in there has been sourced from available documents on teacher knowledge assessments of early literacy skills. So later on, you will have access to the PowerPoint with this, and one of the slides actually gives citations for where those items came from. In the interim, you can always go to the ERIC website and just look in there for a teacher knowledge assessment. There's quite a variety of research that's out there. There's been some reports that have been published by IES through other entities within IES, other areas within IES related to teacher knowledge assessment. So the test as we have it right now is not yet available, but everything that has gone into that is publicly available.
Thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar today and those that stuck around to ask questions. I believe we were able to get through all the questions. The PowerPoint along with the speaker's notes will be available early next week at the same website you went to register for this webinar series, rel-se.fsu.edu. When you close out of this webinar today, a survey will pop up. Please do take a few minutes to complete this survey. We really do value the feedback. We're able to incorporate your feedback to improve future webinars, not only in this series, but also on other topics. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.